Welcome to part two of chapter two or section four, I guess. So we've talked about how Booleans work. We've talked about how control flows work. We've talked about various different related things. But I've hinted at it already a little bit, but there are different ways to compare things. Just like we had the greater than, less than, we had the in command. We have a variety of other different comparison operators. This is important because we have a variety of interesting and varied reasons why we might want to code. I've mentioned the XOR command. You can see it in the terminal below. XOR or XOR compares when things are different. So false XOR true is true, whereas true XOR true is false. Likewise, false XOR false is also false. So I'm not going to spend any time really looking at it, but it's an interesting little quirk. We're going to talk about the other more useful ones. Not to say XOR is not, but I have not used it fairly at all. Um, the challenge for this is talking about telemarketers, seeing whether or not to accept a phone call based on the last four digits. Because apparently we've noticed that if the first or the fourth digit is an 8 or a 9, and the second and third are the same, then it's a telemarketer. Otherwise, we could accept it and be fine. And so the general thought process being input the values, analyze, and then decide whether to pick up or not. So once again, very much if else sounds very much in line, but because there's so much going on here, we would have a lot of what is known as nested if inside of ifs, or if inside of else ifs. It would be really messy unless we had a more interesting and useful way of comparison. This is seen through an OR command. An OR command is true if at least one of them is true. Otherwise, it's false. And so if I say something simple as digit is equal to 8, like we see in the text, we could see something like this. See, it's true. When comparing numbers, equals equals is at the actual equals command. Because if you remember, equals is the assignment operator. Likewise, if you want to make sure something is not equals, you put an exclamation mark if you didn't see that in the text. Okay? Um, so in this case, notice the first one is true. And it doesn't matter that the second one's not because it's an OR command. The opposite of the OR is the AND. Well, I guess that's not necessarily opposite, but more confining is the AND command. And notice when I change this OR to an AND, it's false because they're not both true. For an AND command to work, they both have to be true. And so we can chain them together. So notice I'm putting parentheses around this. Your book first explains it like something else, but I'm going to try to keep it simpler than this. So true and false, we know that because the second one's not true, their combined and is false. But it doesn't matter because the or is the most outermost comparison, and true or false is going to make it true. Another very useful command is the not. Does the exact opposite of what the Boolean you set it next to. So this might be they are not older than a certain age, or they are not male, or they are not in this list of information. Not is a very useful and powerful check. So now we have pretty much all the tools that we kind of need. We know that we have information about the first and fourth digit in the comparison of the second and third. So let's input our values. I'll use the same notation that the book does, but honestly, you could do whatever. Remember, just like before, we could put print commands to help remind us about what each one of these things are so that when the terminal starts asking, just sitting there not doing anything, you don't get confused. For now, we won't, and I'll kind of explain why in a half second. But okay, so remember, if in the end, we're looking for an if and we're looking at an else. So if, assuming that if in the end we might choose to uh, print ignore. So it has to, if it fails, if it fits all the different categories, then we ignore it. Else, print accept. So if it, so in this case, if all of these statements happen to be true, then we're not going to. So if the first number equals 8 or it equals 9, remember if the first digit right there, and the fourth is also just like that right there, and our second number is equal to num3. So remember, this is all the different things that they asked us. They said the first number has to be an 8 or a 9, the fourth digit has to be 8 or a 9, and the middle two numbers equal to each other. If that's the case, we want to ignore this. But if any one of those three parentheses break, we're okay accepting it because that's the pattern we're noticing. Okay, so let's keep it simple. 1, 2, 3, 4. So notice before I click this final equals, 1 is not an 8 or a 9. The second and third numbers are not the same, and the fourth digit is not equal to a 9. This clearly is going to break it, so we should be able to accept it. And that's exactly what we get. But let's run it again. Let's keep it simple. 8, 1, 1, 9. Ignore. Keep it simple. So that's kind of the basics behind this. We don't really have to go into any more. Now, your book does include an interesting thing, though, about input and output redirection. And I do want to mention it briefly, only because it's kind of cool. Not that it's going to be useful very much in the long term, because there are much better ways of handling it. But let's take a look. If we happen to notice, and as I'm sure you have, it's getting kind of annoying having to constantly enter all these, especially if we have multiple lines of input. So maybe we decide to grab these and put them into a text file, txt file. In this situation, notice 8119, just like we just did, we're able to control and do a standard in or a standard out inside the terminal. That's what they're usually called. Um, this command inside of the command line looks like this. And I think you can do the same thing in Bash. In Mac, I'm not certain, but I believe it works the same. This says take this input and put it into this interaction right there, and we get ignore. And let's do that one more time. You can see that right there. But if I change one of them, let's make this 1. Notice we're now able to accept it. Now, if you are on a PC like myself, there is command line and there's PowerShell. And I mentioned PowerShell, I think, in the first video. Notice that this command is a little bit different. We're having to use piping in an interesting way in order for this to work. And this is one of the reasons why I said it's not useful in the long run. There's all sorts of different things. In this case, we're having to get the content from the text, then we pipe it into the Python, and then we output it out. And why do I mention it like that? Well, because it is possible to, let me do this right here, output it into this text document. And you can see that it's literally right here, saying the output of this, if it's inside the terminal, is accept. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that I'm not putting the print statements in there. There's a reason why. In this case, I wanted to keep the output statement of the txt really simple. Now, if I did what I normally like doing, I would normally like to do a print statement before each one of these. Now, I'm already automating this, so I don't necessarily need this anymore. But if I was, because sometimes I'd be automating it and sometimes not, I might want to keep that in there. But there's a cost to keeping it in there. I run this. The output is rewritten each time I run this. And now notice what happens. The output doesn't just say the final decision, it actually has all the outputs that would show up in the terminal normally. So keep that in mind if you decide to. There are benefits and detriments. Um, like I said, there are better ways to do this, and we will get to that eventually. Uh, but however you want and do this. This is one of the reasons why on the very first one I mentioned that you might want to suppress this output when you want to do the interpreter for the judging, because that's exactly how the program's running. It's literally running something like this in the background to understand and receiving it as a text file. That's how it's checking. Anyway, hope this is helpful. If these are, I will continue to output it. But regardless, please do the 5 questions at the end of this chapter. I haven't looked at these ones specifically, but it's a good practice and they're chosen for a reason. It'll help you learn all those nuances. Have a good one.